A mafia boss's car breaks down on a deserted road, and an unexpected act of kindness forces him to make a decision that changes their lives forever. In the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and the engine smoking in the cold desert night, Conrad feels something he hasn't felt in years: helplessness. His 6-year-old son Jasper cries quietly beside him. Then a woman appears from the darkness, a flashlight in one hand, a little girl clutching her other. She offers them the only bottle of water she has. And that single gesture changes everything. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that reminds you what truly matters in life. Jasper looked at the water bottle in the strange woman's hand, then lifted his eyes to his father with a hesitant look. The 6-year-old boy had been taught since he was little that he should never accept anything from a stranger, but his throat was parched, and his tears were still wet on his cheeks. Conrad looked at his son, then at the woman standing in front of them. She wore an old coat that had faded with time and jeans worn thin at the knees, yet everything on her was clean and neatly kept. The hands holding out the bottle were marked with calluses, the kind that came from long familiarity with hard labor. What caught Conrad's attention most was her gaze, not a trace of fear in it even as she faced a strange man in the emptiness of the late night. Conrad nodded to his son. Jasper timidly reached out, took the bottle, murmured thank you, and drank in small, careful sips. The little girl with the woman, about 5 years old, clutched a worn cloth doll stitched over and over with crooked repairs. She tilted her head, looked Conrad up and down, and asked in an innocent voice, "Mister, why are you wearing a suit in the desert at night? Are you going to a party?" Jasper nearly choked on the water, then let out a soft laugh. It was the first laugh the boy had made since the car began to smoke. Conrad watched his son laugh and felt something in his chest ease, just a little. The woman smiled at her daughter and said, "Rosie, don't ask so many questions," but her voice held no scolding. She walked toward the Bentley without waiting to be invited, lifted the hood, and looked inside. The smoke had stopped, but the sharp smell of boiling water still hung thick in the air. She checked for a moment, then said, "The radiator's overheated. Do you have water in the trunk? Mineral water? Filtered water? Anything?" Conrad stood there for a second, unsettled by how strange it felt to be given orders by a woman he didn't know, but he still went to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and searched. There were a few bottles of mineral water he had bought for Jasper to drink on the road. He carried them over and handed them to her. The woman waited a few more minutes for the engine to cool, then carefully poured the water into the radiator. She did everything with the steady competence of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Conrad watched, feeling oddly embarrassed. He was the most powerful man on the west coast of the United States, and yet right now he didn't know what to do except stand there and watch a strange woman fix his car. "I don't know much about cars," he admitted, his voice a little hoarse. The woman didn't laugh at him, didn't look surprised. She only shrugged and said, "Out here, you learn everything or you die waiting for help that never comes." She closed the hood and said, "Try starting it." Conrad got into the car and turned the key. The engine roared, then settled into an even run. He let out a long breath of relief, but the woman shook her head. "The car will run for now, but you shouldn't go far tonight. This road is dangerous after dark. No one comes through here after the sun goes down. Even locals avoid it." Conrad stepped out, the wary instinct of a man who had lived in the underworld rising at once. "Then why are you out here?" The woman looked at him, her eyes not shifting away. "Because I don't have any other choice. I was heading back from the clinic. I had to wait hours for my father's prescription." She fell silent for a moment, then continued, "My house is about 15 minutes away by car. My father knows machines. He can check the car more carefully in the morning. If you want, you can stay the night with us." Conrad hesitated. Every cell in his body screamed at him not to trust strangers, not to follow a stranger to an unfamiliar place. It was the rule of survival he had lived by for 20 years. But then he looked at Jasper. The boy had stopped crying, but his eyes were still red, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The road ahead was pitch black. There was no phone signal, and he didn't know whether it was safe to keep going. He didn't have many options. "All right," Conrad said. "Thank you." The woman nodded and led her daughter back toward the car. She sat in the front passenger seat to give directions, while little Rosie climbed into the back seat beside Jasper. Rosie looked at Jasper and held out her doll. "This is Penny. Her eye fell out last year, but Mom sewed it back on. Do you want to hold her?" penny will help you not be scared." Jasper looked at the patched-up doll, then at the strange little girl smiling at him. He didn't take the doll, but he smiled. Conrad drove in the direction the woman indicated, deeper along the dark dirt road. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. He still didn't know her name. 15 minutes later, the Bentley came to a stop in front of a modest wooden house, standing alone in the middle of dry, barren land. A warm yellow light spilled from a small window, flickering softly against the vast darkness of the desert night. Conrad turned off the engine and looked around. The house wasn't large, perhaps no bigger than the living room in his Las Vegas mansion, yet it appeared solid and carefully tended. A small garden lay along one side of the house, and a few chickens slept inside a coop built by hand. On the porch, an elderly man sat in a rocking chair with a half-burned cigarette between his fingers. He coughed a few dry times at the sound of the car but didn't rise. His eyes were still sharp despite his age, and that gaze fixed on the gleaming black Bentley as if it were some beast that had wandered into his yard uninvited. Bryn opened the car door and stepped out. She said, "Father, I brought guests home. Their car broke down on the road." The man named Walter didn't answer his daughter right away. He rose slowly, stepped down from the porch, and walked straight toward Conrad. He looked at the car first, then at Conrad from head to toe, from the polished leather shoes to the expensive three-piece suit. Walter sniffed and said in a gravelly voice, "First time I've seen someone wearing clothes worth more than my house come here asking for help." Conrad didn't reply. He was used to being judged, scrutinized, tested, but usually the people who did that were afraid of him, or they wanted something from him. This old man didn't. He looked at Conrad the way one might look at a pitiful traveler who had lost his way, not at a powerful kingpin. Conrad silently endured that assessment. Jasper clutched his father's hand, his eyes drooping with sleep. Rosie ran to take her grandfather's hand and tugged at it. "Grandpa, they're nice. Let them come inside." Walter looked down at his granddaughter, and his gaze softened. He nodded, then turned and went back into the house without another word. Bryn led Conrad and his son inside. The house was smaller than Conrad had expected, but everything was neat and clean. The old wooden floor had been polished to a dull shine, and the few belongings each had their proper place. There was nothing extra, yet nothing so lacking that it felt desperate. Conrad let his eyes move around the room and stop at a photograph hanging on the wall near the window. It was a wedding picture. Bryn looked younger in it, perhaps about 20 years old, wearing a simple white dress. She stood beside a brown-haired man with a bright and gentle smile. Both of them radiated a simple kind of happiness Conrad rarely saw in his own world. He looked at the photograph a little longer than necessary, trying to understand the story behind it. Bryn caught his gaze and turned away, busying herself with setting bowls and plates on the table. She didn't explain, and Conrad didn't ask. Dinner was served quickly. Bean soup cooked with vegetables from the garden, homemade bread still warm. There was no meat, no expensive wine, none of the elaborate dishes Conrad was accustomed to seeing on his own table. Yet Jasper ate with more appetite than ever before. He swallowed spoonful after spoonful of soup, chewed each piece of bread without a single complaint or grimace. Normally Jasper was a picky eater, difficult to please even with the most expensive meals. But tonight the boy finished his bowl and asked for another slice of bread. Rosie sat beside him, showing him her doll Penny. She clutched the doll that her mother had carefully mended many times, showing Jasper how even broken things could be loved. She pointed to the eye that had been stitched on slightly uneven compared to the other. Jasper reached out and gently touched the doll, his fingers brushing over the lines of thread. It was the first time the boy had touched something imperfect that was still so deeply loved. In Jasper's world, broken things were thrown away and replaced. No one stitched them. No one kept them. He watched Rosie hug the doll to her chest and wondered why something that had once been broken could still make someone so happy. Walter sat at the head of the table, studying Conrad with a measuring look. He asked casually, "What do you do for a living?" Conrad set down his spoon and answered briefly, "Business." Walter let out a rough chuckle that echoed in the small kitchen. "Business. That word covers a lot of sins, doesn't it?" Conrad didn't answer. He looked at the old man across from him, at those sharp eyes that had seen too much of life. The words struck somewhere deep in his chest, a place he had thought had hardened long ago. He picked up his spoon again and continued eating, but his mind drifted to the sins that the word business had concealed for so many years. After dinner, Bryn led the two children into Rosie's bedroom. The small room held only a single bed and an old wooden dresser, yet it felt cozy in its own quiet way. Crayon drawings were taped unevenly to the walls, and a small shelf held a few fairy tale books with worn covers. Rosie climbed onto the bed first, pulled back the blanket, and patted the empty space beside her. "Jasper sleeps here." Jasper looked toward his father, who was standing in the doorway. Conrad nodded, and the boy climbed into the bed beside Rosie. Bryn tucked the blanket around both of them, and within minutes the two children had drifted into sleep. Conrad stood at the threshold, watching. Jasper was holding Penny the doll in his arms, while Rosie clutched the sleeve of Jasper's shirt, as if she were afraid he might disappear in the night. The two children hadn't known each other for even a single day, yet they slept side by side as though they had been friends for years. Something unfamiliar swelled in Conrad's chest. His son had never truly had a real friend. The children around Jasper were the sons and daughters of business partners, children taught to be polite and to keep their distance. None of them clutched Jasper's sleeve in their sleep. Bryn quietly closed the door and said in a low voice, "You can sleep on the sofa in the living room. I'll bring extra blankets." Conrad nodded his thanks, but he wasn't ready to sleep. He stepped out onto the front porch, where Walter sat in his rocking chair, staring into the desert night. The Nevada night was colder than Conrad had expected. The wind blew down from distant hills, carrying a chill that cut through the skin. Without city lights, the sky was astonishingly clear, millions of stars glittering like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Conrad couldn't remember the last time he had seen a night sky like this, perhaps when he was a boy, before his father was killed, before his life became a chain of long nights in boardrooms and tense days woven with schemes of power. He sat down in the empty chair beside Walter. The two men remained silent for a long while, each lost in his own thoughts. Walter lit a new cigarette, drew in a breath, then coughed harshly. The cough sounded heavy, as though his lungs had endured too much smoke and desert dust over the years. He exhaled and stared straight ahead. "You're not just a businessman, are you?" Conrad neither confirmed nor denied it. He kept his eyes on the darkness, his face unreadable. Walter didn't wait for an answer. He continued, his voice low and unhurried. "Life out here is hard. We lack just about everything. Summers burn your skin. Winters freeze you to the bone. The nearest hospital is more than an hour's drive away, but at least out here I'm free. No one tells me how I have to live." He fell silent for a moment, then went on, his voice sinking deeper. "My son-in-law, Neil, he liked freedom too, but he had to work in the city to feed his wife and child. Neil was a good man, hard-working, loved my daughter and granddaughter more than his own life." Conrad turned to look at him. Walter was staring into empty space, his eyes clouded as if he were watching the past unfold. "Neil died in a factory accident 6 years ago. An industrial press. They said he violated safety procedures. The company said it was his fault. Didn't pay a single cent." Bitterness edged Walter's voice. "Bryn tried to get justice for her husband. Know what they did? Fired her when she was 7 months pregnant. Called her a troublemaker. Blacklisted her so no one else would hire her." Conrad felt something painfully familiar in that story. A factory accident. A company refusing compensation. Firing the one who demanded justice. He had heard similar stories dozens of times in business reports, but they had been nothing more than numbers and lines of text on paper. He had never sat across from the people who survived those numbers. Walter turned and looked straight into Conrad's eyes. The old man's gaze was sharp as a blade, cutting through the calm mask Conrad had worn for so many years. "You look like a man who's used to power, but power without conscience is just cruelty wearing a nice suit." Conrad didn't answer. He couldn't. The words struck the deepest place within him, a place he had believed long buried beneath layers of power and ruthlessness. He sat there beneath the sky filled with stars, and for the first time in many years, he asked himself what kind of man he had become. Conrad woke when the first light of morning slipped through the small window. His back ached from the old sofa with its worn springs, yet strangely he had slept better than he had in many recent nights inside his own luxurious mansion. He sat up, rubbed his neck, and looked out the window. Bryn was already in the garden, bending to pull weeds between the rows of vegetables. Her chestnut brown hair was tied high, revealing the slender curve of her neck dotted with sweat beneath the early sun. The sound of children's laughter drifted in from the yard. Conrad stepped to another window and looked out. Jasper was running after Rosie across the yard, the two of them chasing a hen that clucked and flapped away. Jasper stumbled and rolled onto the grass, and instead of crying as he usually would, he burst into laughter. Rosie ran back to pull him to his feet, and the chase began again. Conrad stood there watching his son for a long moment. He realized something that tightened painfully in his chest. Jasper had laughed more in a single night in this poor house than he had in the past month inside their $1,000,000 mansion. There, the boy had everything: expensive toys, a vast bedroom of his own, servants at every call. But he didn't have laughter like this. Bryn stepped into the kitchen while Conrad was washing his face at the small sink. She began preparing breakfast without saying much. Eggs gathered from the coop that morning, bread toasted on an old cast-iron pan. The scent was simple, but warm and sweet, filling the small kitchen. Walter came in, wiping engine grease from his hands with an old rag. He looked at Conrad and said, "I checked your car. She'll run fine now. But get her checked properly when you reach the city." Conrad nodded his thanks. After breakfast, he rose and pulled a thick stack of cash from inside his suit jacket. It was enough money to buy this house several times over. He placed it on the table in front of Bryn. "Thank you for helping us last night. This is a little something too." He didn't finish the sentence. Bryn looked at the stack of money, then lifted her eyes to meet his. She shook her head firmly, without hesitation. "We don't take money for helping people." Conrad picked up the cash again, feeling oddly awkward. He was a man who could buy almost anything, buy almost anyone, yet he couldn't buy the gratitude of this woman. "Then what can I do to thank you?" he asked, his voice lower now. Bryn straightened and met his gaze without flinching. Her brown eyes were clear and direct, without fear or flattery. "You can live like a decent human being. That's the best thank you anyone can give." Conrad went still. The words were simple, almost brutally so. Live like a decent human being. It sounded easy, yet he wasn't sure he even remembered how. He slipped the money back into his pocket without another word. Jasper ran into the house, his face flushed from play, his hand tightly holding Rosie's. "Dad, do we have to go already?" the boy asked, disappointment plain in his voice. Conrad nodded. "Yes, son, we have to go." Jasper looked at Rosie, then back at his father, his eyes pleading. "Can we come back, Dad? Please?" Conrad didn't know how to answer. He looked at his son, at the brown-haired little girl holding his hand, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Rosie let go of Jasper and ran off for a moment, then returned with a small stone resting in her palm. It wasn't anything special, just a pebble picked up from the yard, yet she offered it to Jasper as if it were a treasure. "So you don't forget me," she said softly. Jasper took the stone and closed his fingers around it, as though it were the most precious gift he had ever been given. "I won't forget," he promised. Conrad led Jasper to the car, the Bentley now parked neatly in front of the yard by Walter. He sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. It purred steadily, no longer sputtering as it had the night before. The car rolled forward, leaving the small house behind. Conrad glanced in the rearview mirror and saw 3 figures standing on the porch, growing smaller as the distance widened. Bryn stood in the middle, one hand resting on Rosie's shoulder, Walter beside them. They remained there until the car disappeared beyond the bend in the road. Jasper turned to look through the back window, his hand still tightly gripping the small stone. Conrad looked at his son in the mirror, then faced forward toward the dirt road, leading back to his world. Yet his mind remained behind at the small house in the desert, with the stranger's words echoing again and again. "You can live like a decent human being." The Bentley rolled through the large iron gates of the mansion late that afternoon. Conrad watched the familiar house rise before him, towering white walls, perfectly trimmed gardens, a marble fountain standing at the center of the courtyard. The lights were already blazing, even though dusk had not yet fully settled. Security guards stood rigid at every corner. Servants waited attentively at the main entrance. His familiar world, the world he had built with blood and power over 20 long years. Yet when the car came to a stop and Conrad stepped out, something felt different. The luxurious mansion suddenly seemed more hollow than he remembered. Pierce, Conrad's most trusted bodyguard, approached the moment his employer's shoes touched the ground. As usual, the man's face showed no emotion, only sharp eyes sweeping quickly over Conrad to ensure he was unharmed. "Sir, everything is under control. The meeting with the East Side has been moved to next week. No one asked where you were." Conrad nodded, but he wasn't truly listening. His mind was still at the small wooden house in the desert, with Walter's story about the son-in-law who had died in a factory, a workplace accident, a company refusing compensation, a wife fired for demanding justice. The fragments circled in his mind, stirring something familiar he couldn't quite grasp. Jasper ran inside, but instead of heading up to his room as he usually did, the boy stood in the hallway and looked around with an odd expression, as though comparing this vast mansion to the small, warm house he had just left behind. That night, after a servant had bathed Jasper and given him dinner, Conrad sat alone in his study. The room was enormous, lined with leather-bound shelves, a massive oak desk dominating the space, tall windows overlooking the glittering lights of Las Vegas. He poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey, but only held it without drinking. He stared at the city lights flickering below, yet what he saw was the star-filled sky over the Nevada desert. He heard the distant hum of the city, yet in his ears echoed Walter's gravelly voice. Power without conscience is just cruelty wearing a nice suit. Conrad set the glass down and pressed the button to summon Pierce. The bodyguard appeared within seconds, standing straight at the door. Conrad didn't turn around. He spoke in a low voice. "Find me everything about workplace accidents at our Nevada facilities in the past 5 years. Everything, including the ones they tried to bury." Pierce didn't ask why. He simply nodded. "Yes, sir." Then he disappeared behind the door. Conrad looked back at the city, but his thoughts were in a factory somewhere in Nevada, where a man named Neil had died 6 years ago. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. The door opened slightly and Jasper stepped in, clutching his pillow, his eyes wide despite the late hour. "Dad, I can't sleep," the boy said quietly. Conrad rose, lifted his son into his arms, and set him down on the large leather sofa beside the desk. He sat next to him and let Jasper lean against his chest. "Why can't you sleep?" he asked. Jasper was silent for a moment, his fingers twisting the corner of the pillow. Then he looked up at his father with clear eyes. "When can we visit Rosie again? She said she'd show me how to feed the chickens." Conrad looked at his son, surprised. Jasper had never asked to see anyone before, never spoken of a friend, never longed for anything beyond new toys. Yet now he was asking about a poor little girl in a wooden house in the desert and a coop full of hens. "Soon," Conrad said, holding his son close. But even as he spoke the word, he didn't know whether it was a promise he could truly keep. 3 days later, Pierce knocked on the door of Conrad's study with a thick stack of files in his hands. He placed them on the desk without a word and stepped back to wait. Conrad looked at the stack, then at Pierce. "Is everything here?" he asked. "Everything I could find, sir, including the things they tried to bury." Conrad nodded for him to leave. When the door closed, he pulled the files toward him and began to read. The first page was a list of workplace accidents at the Nevada branch over the past 5 years. Conrad moved down each line, and his eyes slowly darkened. 3 fatal accidents in 4 years. 3 men had died in his factory. The first, a worker pulled into an industrial loom. Conclusion, worker error, no compensation. The second, a worker fell from scaffolding without guardrails. Conclusion, worker error, no compensation. The third, Conrad turned the page and read the victim's name, Neil Holloway. His heart seemed to miss a beat. He read on, word by word. Industrial press accident, 6 years ago. Victim's hand caught in operating press. Excessive blood loss before reaching the hospital. The official report stated clearly, worker violated safety protocols. No compensation warranted. Conrad flipped to the personal information page. Age, 32. Marital status, married. Wife's name, Bryn Holloway. Address, a remote road in the Nevada desert. He shot to his feet, the office chair rolling back and striking the wall. The file slipped from his hands, white pages scattering across the floor. Bryn Holloway, the woman who had handed him a bottle of water in the night. The woman who had fixed his car, invited him home, fed him and his son, given them a place to sleep. The woman with calloused hands and steady eyes that hadn't shown a trace of fear. She was the widow of a worker who had died in his factory. She had lost her husband because of him, and she had saved his son without knowing who he was. Or had she known? The instinct of a man raised in the underworld surged through Conrad at once. He had seen too many schemes, too many carefully laid traps. Could this be one of them? Had Bryn recognized him from the beginning? Had she appeared deliberately on that empty road, offered help on purpose to gain access? Was she waiting for the right moment to take revenge? Conrad bent to gather the papers, and a photograph slipped free. He picked it up. Neil Holloway, brown hair, a gentle and sincere smile. The same man from the wedding photograph on Bryn's wall. The man Walter had spoken of that night. Neil was a good man, hard-working, loved my daughter and granddaughter more than his own life. Conrad stared at the picture for a long moment, then set it down on the desk. He turned through the remaining pages, searching for something that might answer the suspicions circling his mind, and then he saw a name appearing at the end of each accident report. Tucker Webb, Nevada branch manager. Conrad remembered him. Tucker Webb, a middle-aged man with a wide smile and endless flattery. At every quarterly meeting, Tucker had delivered polished numbers. Profits up, costs down, never any problems. Now Conrad understood why costs had fallen. Now he understood why no problems had ever been reported upward. Because Tucker had buried them all. Buried faulty equipment, buried safety violations, buried deaths, and blamed the dead so no compensation would have to be paid. Conrad stood at the window, looking out over the city, Neil Holloway's photograph clenched in his hand. He didn't know whether Bryn had any hidden plan, but he knew one thing with certainty. Someone would have to answer for what had happened. At the same time, hundreds of miles from Las Vegas, Bryn knelt beside a large basin behind her house, washing clothes by hand. Sweat ran along her temples, but she didn't pause. This was work she had done every day, year after year, since she had been fired and no one else would hire her. Rosie sat playing on the steps nearby, Penny the doll resting in her arms. The little girl watched her mother for a moment, then asked softly, "Mommy, will Jasper come back?" Bryn stopped and looked at her daughter. She was silent for a long while, unsure how to answer. At last, she said gently, though something bitter edged her voice, "I don't know, sweetheart. Rich people don't usually come back to places like this." Rosie lowered her head and hugged the doll tighter. "But Jasper said he'd come back. He promised." Bryn looked at her daughter, her heart tightening. She knew the value of promises made by the wealthy. Her husband had believed the company's promises of safety, and he had died. She had believed the law's promise of justice, and she had been cast aside. Yet even as she tried not to admit it, there had been something in the eyes of the man in the suit that night that felt different. When he had watched his son laugh with Rosie, when he had sat in silence listening to her father speak, when he had gone still at her words before leaving, something had shifted in his gaze. Bryn shook her head, brushing away wandering thoughts, and returned to the washing. She didn't have time to dwell on rich men and their promises. She had a child to raise and a sick father to care for. That was her reality. Conrad decided to investigate on his own before drawing any conclusions. He couldn't place complete trust in what was written on paper, nor could he rely solely on his own suspicions. He needed to see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears. That morning, he opened his wardrobe and searched in the deepest corner. There, tucked away, were old clothes from the days when he had nothing, before he became Conrad Ashford, the most powerful mafia boss on the West Coast. He pulled out a faded shirt, jeans worn thin at the knees, and an old baseball cap. When he stepped out of the room, Pierce was waiting in the hallway as usual. The bodyguard looked at his employer's unusual appearance, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes, before returning to calm composure. "Where are you going dressed like that, sir?" Conrad answered shortly. "The Nevada factory." Pierce stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Sir, this is dangerous. Let me send men. We can investigate without you having to." Conrad raised a hand to stop him. "I need to see it with my own eyes." Pierce was silent for a moment, then nodded. He knew when to object and when to obey. "At least let me come along and observe from a distance." Conrad considered, then agreed. 2 hours later, Conrad stood at the gates of Ashford Industries' Nevada branch, looking like an ordinary laborer seeking work. He passed through security unnoticed, submitted an application under a false name, and was led on a tour of the factory with several other applicants. What he saw left him stunned. From the outside, the factory looked polished, with gleaming signage and freshly painted fences. Inside was a different story. The equipment was old, many machines rusted at their joints. The production line groaned and rattled as if it might collapse at any moment. Workers labored with dark circles under their eyes, shoulders hunched from exhaustion, no one speaking to anyone else. At lunchtime, Conrad sat in a corner of the cafeteria, pretending to eat a cheap meal while listening to the workers nearby. Two middle-aged men sat close, speaking with weary bitterness. Tucker doesn't care if we die. He only cares about numbers. Last week, a kid nearly lost his hand because of a broken cutter. You know what he said? Don't slow down the line. The other man sighed. Remember Neil? He worked here 7 years, never made a mistake. And when he died, they said it was his fault. His wife tried to fight. They destroyed her life. Bryn, right? She used to work here too. Good woman. Worked hard. Never complained. They fired her for asking questions. Fired her when she was 7 months pregnant. 7 months. An older worker beside them joined in, his voice low and haunted. Neil wasn't careless. I worked the same shift. That machine had been broken for months. We reported it several times. Tucker refused to fix it. Said it cost too much. Then when Neil died, he blamed it all on him. Conrad sat there listening, each word cutting into his chest like a blade. Bryn hadn't known who he was. She had no scheme. She had simply been a kind woman helping a stranger stranded in the night, just as she had likely done for others before. And he had suspected her. He had thought she might be setting a trap. Regret rose inside him, heavy and suffocating. He regretted doubting her, but he regretted even more what his company had done to her. Her husband had died because of machinery no one bothered to repair. She had been fired while pregnant for daring to demand justice. She had been smeared and blacklisted so no one would hire her. And all of it had happened under the name Ashford Industries, under his name. That same day, at the small house in the desert, Bryn opened the mailbox and took out a white envelope. She immediately recognized the logo of the familiar law firm in the corner, the firm representing Ashford Industries. She opened it and skimmed the bold, printed lines. There was nothing new. A reminder not to continue defaming and slandering the company. A warning of serious legal consequences if she persisted. A threat to sue her for damages. Bryn looked at the letter, her hand trembling slightly though her eyes were dry. She had cried all her tears 6 years ago, when they buried Neil in the cheapest coffin she could afford. She had no tears left. Walter stepped onto the porch and saw his daughter standing motionless with the letter in her hand. What did they send this time? He asked, his voice tired. Bryn crumpled the letter into a ball and threw it into the trash beside her. Nothing new, just more threats. She turned and walked back into the house, not letting her father see the way her shoulders were trembling. 2 days after his visit to the factory, Conrad sat in his private office at the Las Vegas headquarters and ordered Pierce to summon Tucker Webb. No explanation, no warning about the subject, just a brief call. Mr. Ashford wants to see you, immediately. Tucker Webb arrived that afternoon. He walked into the office with the confidence of a successful manager, dressed in an expensive gray suit, polished leather shoes gleaming, a wide smile already in place. He had no idea he was stepping into a lion's den. Mr. Ashford. What an honor. Tucker strode toward Conrad, both hands extended for a handshake. The Nevada branch is performing excellently this quarter. I'm preparing a report for you. Profits are up 12% compared to. Conrad didn't rise. He didn't take the offered hand. He simply looked at Tucker with eyes as cold as ice and pointed to the chair across the desk. Sit. A single word, yet something in the tone made Tucker falter mid-step. The smile on his face wavered, though he quickly forced it back into place. Perhaps the boss was in a foul mood, he told himself. He had handled difficult superiors before. He sat down, maintaining his polite expression. What would you like to discuss, Mr. Ashford? If it's about next year's expansion plan, I can present it right now. Conrad said nothing. He picked up the thick stack of files on his desk and dropped them in front of Tucker. The sound of paper striking wood cracked sharply in the silent room. Explain. Tucker glanced at the files, then at Conrad. He let out a strained laugh and began flipping through the pages. The first page was an accident report. The second showed photographs of the scene. The third contained the personnel file of Neil Holloway. With each page Tucker turned, the color drained further from his face. His hands began to tremble. Sir, these workers were careless, he stammered, scrambling for justification. They violated safety protocols. I did everything according to. Conrad cut him off, his voice devoid of emotion. 3 men dead, 3 families destroyed, and you told me it was their fault. Tucker swallowed, his throat dry. He glanced around the room as if searching for escape, but the door was closed and he knew someone stood outside. The profit margins. He began again, his voice shaking. I had to cut costs. Those machines were too expensive to repair or replace. I did it for the organization. I did it for the company's profits, Mr. Ashford. You have to understand. If I hadn't reduced expenses then. Conrad rose slowly. He walked around the desk, each step measured against the wooden floor. Tucker shrank back in his chair as Conrad stopped directly before him, looking down from above. Conrad's voice was colder than winter. My organization does not profit from the bones of innocent men. Tucker slid from the chair onto his knees, hands clasped together in desperate plea. Please, Mr. Ashford, I have a family. I have a wife and children. Please, I only did what I thought was best for the company. Give me one chance. Conrad looked down at the man kneeling before him, his face untouched by feeling. So did Neil Holloway. He had a wife. He had a daughter. Where is his family now? Tucker had no answer. He remained on his knees, shaking, tears spilling down his face. He had seen what happened to those who disappointed Conrad Ashford. He understood that his fate had already been decided. Conrad gave a slight nod, and from the shadows in the corner 2 large men stepped forward. They had been there all along, silent as statues, waiting for the command. Tucker screamed as they seized his arms and hauled him upright. No, please, I'll fix everything. I'll compensate them. Please, Mr. Ashford. Conrad turned away and walked toward the window overlooking the city. He didn't look at Tucker again. Make sure he understands the cost of his lies. Every single one of them. Tucker was dragged from the room, his pleas echoing down the corridor, growing fainter and fainter until they vanished when the elevator doors closed. Conrad stood at the window, staring at the glittering lights of Las Vegas below. He felt no satisfaction. He felt no sense of justice fulfilled, only emptiness. Tucker Webb would disappear from the company and from life. No one would find him. No one would ask about him. That was how Conrad's world operated, but it wouldn't bring Neil Holloway back. It wouldn't erase 6 years of Bryn's suffering. It wouldn't return a normal childhood to little Rosie. Conrad closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind them, he saw again the image of a woman with calloused hands, offering a bottle of water to his son in the cold desert night. It was very late, yet Conrad still sat alone in his dark office. He hadn't turned on the lights. Only the glow of Las Vegas shimmered upward through the vast window, millions of lights flickering like fallen stars scattered across the earth. But Conrad saw none of it. His eyes were open, yet his mind was elsewhere, in a small wooden house in the desert, at a simple dinner of bean soup, with a woman whose steady eyes had shown no fear. Tucker had been punished. He would never appear again, never harm anyone else. But what had that changed? Neil Holloway was still dead, his body decaying beneath 3 feet of soil for 6 long years. Bryn had still lost her husband, still been fired while pregnant, still forced to raise her child alone in poverty. Rosie had still grown up without a father, still clutched a patched doll instead of being lifted into her father's arms. Punishing Tucker didn't erase the past. Nothing could erase the past. Conrad reached for the whiskey bottle and poured a full glass. He watched the amber liquid catch the reflection of the city lights, but he didn't drink. He simply sat there holding the glass and thinking. He had killed many men in his life, directly and indirectly. He had ordered traitors dealt with, rivals eliminated, threats to his empire removed. He had never lost sleep over those acts. In his world, it was the law of survival. Kill or be killed. But Neil Holloway hadn't been an enemy. He had been an ordinary man who went to work to feed his wife and child. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, working with a broken machine no one bothered to fix. And he had died. For the first time in many years, Conrad felt real guilt. Not the kind that came from a miscalculation in business. Not the kind that followed a lost deal. This was the kind that ate from within, making it impossible for him to swallow the whiskey in his hand. Bryn still didn't know the truth. She didn't know the man she had saved in the desert night was the owner of the company that had killed her husband and destroyed her life. She didn't know she had handed his son a bottle of water and offered him shelter. Conrad faced 2 choices. 1, remain silent. Send anonymous compensation to the Holloway family. Pretend that night on the desert road had never happened. Forget and continue living his life. 2, face Bryn. Tell her the truth. Accept her hatred. Accept being driven from her door, cursed, looked at with contempt. The first choice would be far easier. The second, far more painful. A soft knock drew him from his thoughts. The door opened slightly, and Jasper stepped inside, small feet silent against the wooden floor. The boy wore blue pajamas, hugging his pillow to his chest, and in his hand was the small stone Rosie had given him. "Dad, you promised we'd go back." Conrad looked at his son, at the pebble resting in that tiny palm. It was nothing special, yet Jasper guarded it like treasure. He hadn't let it out of his sight since they left that house. "I miss Rosie," Jasper added quietly. "I promised I'd come back. I don't want to break my promise." Conrad set the glass down and pulled his son into his arms. He held Jasper close, feeling the warmth of his small body, and made his decision. He would go back. He would tell the truth. No matter how much Bryn hated him, no matter if she drove him away or never wished to see him again, he owed her that truth. At the very least, he could do that. 1 month passed. 1 month of Conrad preparing himself for this moment. 1 month of arranging everything, gathering every piece of evidence, and asking himself hundreds of times whether he was doing the right thing. And now he was here, on the familiar dirt road cutting through the Nevada desert, the Bentley rolling slowly over potholes and drifting sand. This time Conrad was dressed differently. No 3-piece suit, no polished leather shoes, no Patek Philippe on his wrist. Just a simple light blue shirt, khaki trousers, and sneakers. He wanted to come here as an ordinary man, not as a powerful kingpin. On the passenger seat rested a bag of medicine he had asked his private doctor to prepare for Walter's lung condition. In the back seat was a new doll for Rosie. Not the most expensive one, but a soft cloth doll like Penny, so the old doll could have a companion. And inside his jacket pocket lay a thick envelope filled with documents, the proof of the truth he was about to speak. Jasper hadn't come this time. Conrad had explained to his son that he needed to see Bryn alone first, that there were things adults had to discuss. Jasper hadn't understood. The boy had only been disappointed that he couldn't see Rosie. He had asked his father to tell her that he missed her and would return soon. Conrad hadn't promised anything. He didn't know whether they would ever be welcomed at this house again after today. The car came to a stop in front of the small wooden house. Everything looked as he remembered. The green vegetable patch, the chicken coop clucking softly, the rocking chair on the porch. Yet something felt different. He felt heavier, as if gravity here pressed twice as hard. Rosie was the first to notice the car. She had been playing in the yard with Penny, and when she saw the familiar Bentley, her eyes lit up. "Mommy, it's Jasper's daddy." She ran toward the house, shouting as she went. "Mommy, Mommy." Bryn stepped onto the porch, flour still dusting her hands. Perhaps she had been baking. She looked at the car, then at the man stepping out, and her brows drew together. Surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by caution. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone who had learned to guard herself. Conrad walked closer and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at Bryn standing above him, and suddenly every word he had rehearsed for a month vanished from his mind. "I came to tell you the truth," he said, his voice low and steady. Bryn crossed her arms over her chest, her brown eyes studying him carefully. What truth? Conrad drew in a deep breath. This was it. The moment he had feared for an entire month. The moment he knew would change everything. He met her eyes without looking away. "My name is Conrad Ashford. I own Ashford Industries, including the factory where your husband worked." Silence. Bryn stood motionless, her face as still as stone, as if she hadn't understood what he had just said. Conrad saw her blink, saw her lips part slightly, saw her body stiffen inch by inch as the truth settled into her mind. Then she understood. "You," her voice was barely a whisper, "you own that company." She stepped back as though he were a venomous snake that had slithered too close. Her eyes widened, filled with horror and fury. That night on the road, her voice trembled. "Did you know? Did you know who I was?" Conrad shook his head. "No. I swear I didn't know until I investigated, until I read the files. That night I was only a father with a broken car and a crying child. I didn't know who you were until I read the accident report about your husband." Bryn trembled from head to toe. Tears spilled from her eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of betrayal, of 6 years of suffering finally finding a target. "Get out," she said, her voice breaking. Conrad didn't move. "Bryn, please listen." Get out, she screamed, losing control for the first time. Her voice shattered with pain and fury. Get out of my house. Get out. Get out. Rosie stood frozen at the edge of the yard, Penny falling from her hands onto the dirt. She had never seen her mother scream like that, never seen her lose control. The little girl began to cry, not understanding what was happening. The front door opened and Walter stepped outside. The old man took in the scene before him, his daughter weeping and shouting, the man standing in the yard, and he understood at once. His eyes met Conrad's, and there was no surprise in them, only a deep sorrow, as if he had known all along that this day would come. Conrad didn't leave. He stood motionless in the yard, enduring Bryn's fury the way a man endures a storm he knows he deserves. Bryn kept shouting, kept ordering him off her property, but he didn't move. I'm not leaving until you hear the truth, he said, his voice low and unwavering. Bryn stopped, breathing hard. Her eyes were red, tears still streaming down her face. She let out a bitter, broken laugh. The truth? Your company killed my husband and threw me out like garbage. What more truth is there? What are you going to say? That you're sorry? That you didn't know? Will your apology bring Neil back? Conrad didn't answer with words. Instead, he slowly dropped to his knees in the middle of the dirt yard, the knees of his khaki trousers pressed into the dust, his hands hanging at his sides. He knelt before Bryn like a guilty man before a judge. Bryn froze. She stood there, mouth slightly open, unable to believe what she was seeing. The man who had worn an expensive suit that night, the man whose power she had felt in every quiet gesture, was now kneeling in the dirt at her feet. Walter stepped out of the house and stood beside his daughter. He looked at Conrad kneeling on the ground, at Bryn weeping, but he said nothing. He simply waited. Conrad lifted his face and looked straight into Bryn's eyes. His voice was low and trembled faintly, not from fear, but from emotions he had held back for too long. Your husband didn't die because of his mistake. He died because a man I trusted chose profit over people. The machine that killed him had been broken for months. Tucker Webb knew. He covered it up. He blamed Neil to avoid responsibility. He blamed your husband so he wouldn't have to spend money fixing the machine or paying compensation. Bryn stood still, tears falling, but she wasn't screaming anymore. She was listening, every word sinking in. I didn't know, Conrad continued, but that doesn't excuse me. I should have known. I should have paid attention. I should have been more than a man who counts money. I am the owner. I am responsible for what happens in my company. Not knowing doesn't make me innocent. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the thick envelope, holding it up to her. This is the real accident report. This is proof that Tucker hid everything. And this, he turned to the final page, is confirmation that Tucker Webb no longer works for the company. He paused for a breath, then added, his voice turning to ice, he won't be harming anyone ever again. Bryn took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it and read page after page. The words blurred through her tears. Reports of equipment malfunction 6 months before the accident. Internal emails from Tucker refusing repairs because they were too costly. Statements from workers saying the machine had long been unsafe. And on the final page, the official confirmation that Neil Holloway had violated no safety procedures. He was innocent. 6 years. 6 years she had fought alone to prove Neil wasn't at fault. 6 years of being looked at as a woman who couldn't accept reality. 6 years of lying awake at night, wondering if they were right, if Neil had truly been careless, if she had been deceiving herself. And now, at last, someone was acknowledging the truth. Bryn wept, not from hatred for Conrad anymore, but from release, because someone had finally said her husband was innocent, because Neil's name had finally been cleared. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the porch steps, clutching the papers to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Walter stepped beside her and placed his aged hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, steady and silent. Rosie ran to her mother and wrapped her arms around her, crying too, though she didn't understand. She only knew her mother was hurting and wanted to make it better. Conrad remained on his knees in the yard. He didn't rise. He looked at the woman weeping on the steps, at the little girl clinging to her, and felt his heart ache. Walter looked down at Conrad. The old man's gaze was no longer sharp as it had been that first night. Now it held something more complicated, a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. You came back, Walter said in his gravelly voice. Most powerful men would have just sent a check and forgotten we existed. You could have sent money and disappeared. Why did you come back?" Conrad looked at the old man, then at Bryn, still crying. "Because she told me to live like a decent human being. And a decent human being doesn't hide from the consequences of his actions." Conrad slowly rose to his feet and brushed the dust from his knees. He didn't rush, didn't attempt to look composed. He simply stood there and waited for Bryn to steady herself. Rosie was still clinging to her mother, wide eyes fixed on him in confusion. She didn't understand why her mother was crying, why the visitor had knelt in the dirt, why the air had suddenly grown so tight and heavy. Bryn wiped her tears with the back of her hand and tried to regain control. She stood, still clutching the stack of papers to her chest as though they were something sacred. Walter remained beside her, his aged hand resting firmly on her shoulder. Conrad spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "I want to compensate your family. Enough money for you and Rosie to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. Enough for Rosie to attend the best schools. Enough to treat Walter's illness. Enough so you never have to exhaust yourself just to survive." Bryn looked at him, her eyes still red but now sharpened with something else, perhaps bitter irony. She shook her head slowly. "Money won't bring Neil back. Money won't give Rosie her father. It won't buy back the 6 years I lost, the nights I cried alone, the times Rosie asked why her daddy wasn't coming home. Can your money purchase those things?" Conrad didn't look away. "I know it can't. Nothing can bring Neil back, but I want to do what's right. Not just for you. For every worker still inside that factory. For families who might become like yours if nothing changes." Bryn folded her arms, studying him with open skepticism. "And how do you plan to do that? Fire a few more managers and pretend none of this ever happened?" Conrad drew in a slow breath. This was the hardest part. This was where he would make an offer that might anger her even more. "I want you to help me change it." Bryn blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "What?" "I want you to help me transform the company. You know what workers need because you lived it. You fought for it. I need someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth, someone who can't be bought by money or power." Bryn let out a harsh laugh, sharp and incredulous. "You want me to work for the company that killed my husband? You must be out of your mind." Conrad didn't flinch. "I want you to change it. I want you to make sure no other wife loses her husband the way you lost yours. I don't want you working for that company. I want you reshaping it. I want you to guarantee that no family suffers what yours did." Silence settled over the yard. Bryn didn't reject him, but she didn't accept. She only stood there, searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was sincere or performing yet another calculated move. Conrad took a business card and another thicker envelope from his pocket and placed them on the porch step near her feet. "The offer stands. You don't have to decide today. The money is for Rosie's education, no strings attached. Whether you agree or not, it belongs to her." He turned toward his car, then paused and looked back once more. "You can think about it. My number is on the card." Then he drove away, leaving Bryn standing with the documents in her arms, the envelope at her feet, and an offer she didn't know how to carry. A week passed. Bryn wrestled with the decision every day and every night. She would glance at the business card lying on the kitchen table, stare at it for long moments, then turn away. She hated Conrad Ashford. She hated his company. She hated everything tied to that name. Yet she couldn't deny that he had returned. He had knelt before her. He had told the truth. One evening, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Walter sat beside his daughter. He didn't speak much, only a single quiet sentence. Hating him won't bring Neil back, but helping those workers might save someone else's husband, someone else's father. Bryn didn't answer. The next morning, as Rosie ate breakfast, she looked up and asked, "Mommy, when is Jasper coming back?" "He promised to teach me chess." Bryn looked at her daughter, at the clear, hopeful eyes, and remembered that night on the desert road. She had helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She hadn't asked who he was. She hadn't demanded anything in return. She had simply acted according to her nature. If she refused now out of hatred, would she be any different from the people who had wronged her? If she let bitterness rule her, would she still be the Bryn Neil had loved? That evening, after Rosie was asleep and Walter had gone to his room, Bryn picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. Conrad answered on the second ring. Ashford. Bryn inhaled deeply. "I'll do it." Silence filled the other end of the line. Then Conrad's voice came back, unable to hide a trace of surprise. "Are you sure? But I don't work for you, Bryn said firmly. I work for the workers, and if I ever see you sacrifice safety for profit, I walk. Conrad didn't hesitate. That's exactly what I need. On the first day, Bryn stepped into the headquarters of Ashford Industries. She felt like a creature from another planet. The skyscraper towered above her, its glass facade gleaming under the Las Vegas sun. The lobby stretched wide and cavernous, black marble floors polished to a mirror shine, expensive abstract paintings mounted on the walls. Employees moved briskly in tailored suits and elegant dresses, high heels clicking sharply against stone. And in the middle of it all stood Bryn, wearing a simple white shirt, clean jeans, worn flat shoes, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. People looked at her as though she were lost. The receptionist lifted her head with visible irritation, ready to dismiss her, until Pierce appeared and escorted her to the top floor. Bryn's first meeting with senior management took place that very afternoon. She sat at one end of the long conference table, surrounded by men and women whose clothing likely cost more than her house. They looked at her with curiosity edged in disdain, exchanging glances heavy with implication. Conrad sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. He gestured for Bryn to begin. She stood, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice remained steady. She presented the proposals she had prepared through the night. Monthly safety inspections instead of yearly ones, a 20% increase in base wages, full health and maternity coverage for all workers, an anonymous reporting channel so employees could report violations without fear of retaliation. The room erupted. A silver-haired executive leapt to his feet, face flushed red. "Who is this woman to tell us how to run our business?" Another voice cut in. "This will cut profits by 15%. Mr. Ashford, you can't be serious." Objections rose from every side of the table. Bryn stood there feeling like prey surrounded by hunters. But she didn't step back. She had faced worse than this. She had been fired while pregnant, threatened by lawyers, turned away everywhere she sought work. Though her hands trembled, she remembered what she had already survived. Angry executives didn't frighten her anymore. Conrad rose slowly. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. His tone was low and cold, devoid of emotion, yet it silenced the room as if someone had flipped a switch. "Anyone who disagrees with these changes can leave. Now, I don't need people who count coins while workers die." No one moved. No one dared meet his gaze. After several seconds of absolute silence, Conrad sat down and signaled for the meeting to continue. Bryn looked at him, and for the first time, she saw another face of the power he carried. This wasn't power used to dominate and crush. This was power used to shield. A week later, Bryn left work late after finishing a mountain of paperwork. The underground parking garage was nearly empty, the echo of her footsteps bouncing off concrete walls. She walked toward the old car Conrad had arranged for her to use when a figure stepped from behind a column. Bryn stopped, her pulse quickening. The man's face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, his lips split, but she recognized him. Tucker Webb. "You think you've won," he spat, hatred dripping from his voice. "You ruined my life. You think you beat me." Bryn stepped back, but she didn't scream. She had faced deeper fear than this. She had stood beside her husband's coffin and remained upright. Tucker didn't frighten her. He moved closer, fists clenched. "I'm going to make you pay." Before he could finish, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. Conrad stepped forward, his face glacial, gray eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "Touch her, and I'll make what happened to you last time look like a vacation." Tucker spun around. The color drained from his face when he saw who stood there. He staggered back, one step, then another, as if confronted by death itself. Conrad advanced, his voice quiet yet carrying through the empty garage. "You have 10 seconds to disappear. Forever. If I ever see your face again, they won't find enough of you to bury." Tucker didn't need the threat repeated. He turned and ran, vanishing down the stairwell within seconds. Bryn stood there, her heart still pounding, though not from fear now. She looked at Conrad, unsure what to feel. "How did you know?" she asked. "I've had people watching you since day one," Conrad replied calmly, as if assigning surveillance were the most natural act in the world. "No one threatens what's mine." Bryn frowned. "I'm not yours." Conrad met her gaze. His gray eyes softened just slightly, though the emotion within them remained difficult to read. "No, but you're under my protection. Whether you like it or not." Time passed, and Bryn gradually adjusted to her new rhythm of life. She learned how to navigate a world of expensive suits and endless meetings. Yet she never altered who she was. She continued to dress simply, continued to speak her mind plainly, continued to bow to no one. Strangely enough, that was what began to earn her respect. The workers at the Nevada factory heard about her, about the changes she had proposed, and they started calling her one of us. Every weekend, Conrad drove out to the small house in the desert. The first time he visited after Bryn began working, he wore the same shirt and khakis as before. The second time, he arrived in a plain t-shirt and jeans. The third time, he wore an old pair of sneakers he hadn't touched in 10 years. With each visit, he looked simpler, more ordinary, less like a mafia kingpin and more like a regular father. Jasper and Rosie became inseparable. Whenever the Bentley appeared at the end of the dirt road, Rosie would run into the yard shouting, "Jasper's here, Jasper's here," and Jasper would leap out of the car before his father even turned off the engine, running to embrace her as though they had been apart for a year instead of a week. One afternoon, the children played in the yard, while the adults sat inside drinking tea. Jasper had brought a new remote-controlled car Conrad had just bought for him, an expensive one that could climb rough ground and outrun a bicycle. Rosie stared at it with shining eyes. "Wow. Can I try?" she asked, pointing at the controller. Jasper didn't hesitate. "Here, you can have it." He handed her both the car and the remote. "It's yours." Rosie shook her head, even though her eyes clung to the toy. "Mommy says I can't take expensive things." Jasper thought for a moment, biting his lip with exaggerated seriousness. Then his face brightened. "Then let's share. Every time I visit, it's yours too." Rosie beamed, her smile lighting up her small face. "Deal. And I'll teach you how to feed the chickens. Don't be scared. They only bite a little." Jasper puffed out his chest, trying to appear brave. "I'm not scared." But a few minutes later, when a large hen approached his feet, his face went pale, and he jumped behind Rosie. She burst into laughter while Jasper attempted to salvage his dignity. "I'm not scared. I just didn't want to step on her." Bryn and Conrad stood on the porch, watching the children from a distance. Their laughter carried through the peaceful afternoon, blending with the desert wind and the soft clucking of hens. Bryn watched Jasper and saw how naturally he laughed with Rosie, so different from the guarded, withdrawn boy she had first met beside the broken car in the night. "He's different when he's with her." "Happier," she said. Conrad nodded, his eyes never leaving his son. "He's never had a real friend before. Just the children of business partners trained to be polite and keep their distance. They never laughed with him the way Rosie does." Bryn glanced at him and noticed a deep sadness in his gray eyes. "That's sad." Conrad turned toward her, then back to the children. "It is. I'm trying to change that." That afternoon, Conrad followed Walter into the back garden. The old man handed him a shovel and pointed to a patch of earth that needed turning for tomatoes. Conrad gripped the shovel awkwardly, unsure where to begin, but he didn't refuse. He drove the blade into the soil and started digging, even though his posture looked almost comical. 2 hours later, his hands were blistered, his back aching, dirt packed beneath every fingernail. Yet he had finished a clean row of turned earth. Walter watched with a cigarette between his lips and gave a slow nod. Not bad for a man who probably never held a shovel before. Conrad looked at his blistered palms, then at the row of soil he had dug. A rare smile touched his mouth. Not the familiar cold curve, but something genuine. "First time I've done anything real in years." That night, after a simple dinner and a long afternoon filled with the children's laughter, the small house gradually settled into quiet. Jasper and Rosie were asleep in Rosie's little bed, curled together like 2 kittens. Walter had gone to his room early, his lingering cough leaving him exhausted, though the new medicine Conrad had brought allowed him to breathe far more easily. Only Conrad and Bryn remained on the porch, each seated in an old wooden chair, looking out at the desert night. The Nevada sky was clear as crystal, millions of stars scattered to the edge of the horizon. There were no city lights, no traffic noise, only the wind brushing through dry shrubs and the distant hum of insects. They sat in silence for a long time, neither feeling the need to speak. The quiet wasn't heavy or strained. It felt natural, as if they had been sitting side by side like this for years. Bryn spoke first. She kept her eyes on the star-filled sky, her voice soft, as though she were speaking more to herself than to Conrad. "He wasn't perfect. Neil, I mean. He snored so loudly some nights I had to shove him just to get any sleep. He forgot anniversaries. Every single year he forgot our wedding day, even when I reminded him a week in advance. He left dirty clothes everywhere, never remembered to take out the trash, and when he cooked, he burned the pot. She gave a small laugh, threaded with longing. But he always said, "We're poor, but we're clean." He said it whenever I worried about money, whenever I felt like I wasn't enough. I try to live by that every day, even without him beside me. Conrad listened without interruption. He didn't comment. He simply sat and let her speak. When Bryn fell quiet, he lifted his gaze to the stars and began in a voice low and distant. "My father was betrayed and killed by his best friend when I was 15, shot in our own living room. I watched him die." Bryn turned toward him, her brown eyes wide in the darkness. She said nothing, only listened. Conrad continued, his voice steady yet fractured beneath the surface. "After that, I trusted no one. I built walls so high no one could climb them. I became powerful, so no one could ever hurt me again." The wind moved across the porch, carrying the cool scent of desert sand. Bryn asked gently, "And did it work?" Conrad looked down at his hands, still marked with blisters from digging that afternoon. "It kept me alive, but I'm not sure I was ever really living." Silence returned, deeper now, yet strangely gentle. "Sometimes quiet holds more truth than words ever could," Bryn asked softly, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. "Then why do you trust me? You barely know me." Conrad turned to her, gray eyes meeting brown in the faint starlight. He studied her for a long moment before answering, weighing each word. "Because you gave me water when you didn't know who I was. That was the first time in 20 years anyone gave me something without wanting something in return. You didn't see a mafia boss. You saw a father with a frightened little boy. And you helped." Bryn looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see Conrad Ashford, the most powerful man on the West Coast. She didn't see the man in tailored suits, or the figure whose orders made people disappear. She saw a lonely man, one who had built walls around his heart for 20 years and had forgotten what it felt like to be trusted. The changes Conrad implemented within the company weren't welcomed by everyone. Beneath the calm surface of the Ashford Industries empire, a current of resentment simmered quietly. Those who had profited from the old ways, men who had grown rich by exploiting workers and cutting safety costs for their own gain, now saw their steady stream of easy money threatened. One weekend night, inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Las Vegas, 3 men sat around a worn wooden table. A single oil lamp cast long shadows against damp brick walls. They were senior managers within the organization, men who had once stood close to Tucker Webb and benefited from the corrupt system he had built. The gray-haired man spoke first, his voice thick with bitterness. "Conrad is destroying everything we built. Everything. 20 years of arrangements, 20 years of careful greasing, and now he wants to burn it down in a matter of months." The second man, heavyset with a gold ring gleaming on his little finger, nodded sharply. "Profits are down 15%. Our dividends are cut. He's forcing us to raise wages, buy insurance for the workers, repair machinery every month. Where do you think that money comes from? It comes from our pockets." The youngest of the 3, though his eyes were the coldest, leaned back in his chair. All because of that woman. She came from nowhere, and now she's pulling Conrad's strings like a puppet. The gray-haired man shook his head. "No, she's not controlling him. She's his weakness. Haven't you seen the way he looks at her? The way he protects her? He hasn't had a weakness in 20 years. Now he does. If we want Conrad back on the old path, we aim at her." The youngest man gave a thin smile. "We target her, and he'll have to choose, her or the empire. I don't think he'll throw away everything he built for some country widow." They didn't know that outside the warehouse, concealed in shadow, someone was listening. Pierce never allowed a potential threat to drift beyond his reach. The next morning he stood before Conrad in the office, his voice low and grave. "Sir, there's movement. Some of our people are watching the Holloway house." Conrad had been signing documents. His pen stopped mid-stroke. He looked up, and his gray eyes turned to ice in an instant. "Who?" Pierce gave him 3 names. Senior managers, former allies of Tucker Webb. Conrad set the pen down and walked to the window. Las Vegas stretched glittering below. But his mind was far away, at the small wooden house in the Nevada desert, where a woman and her little girl were living a quiet life. "Anyone who touches that family answers to me personally," Conrad said, his voice not raised yet cold as steel. Double the protection around that house, day and night. But don't let them know. I don't want Bryn worrying. Pierce nodded and left. Conrad remained by the window for a long moment, his hand tightening into a fist. He had built this empire on blood and tears, eliminated countless enemies, become a man no one dared cross. Yet now, for the first time, he had something to lose beyond his own life. In the days that followed, Bryn began to sense that something wasn't right. She noticed a strange car parked at the end of the dirt road, a vehicle that belonged to no one in the area. She saw figures moving in the darkness at night, shapes trying not to be seen, yet not skilled enough to fool a woman accustomed to vigilance. Walter noticed as well. "You seen strangers around here?" he asked one evening. Bryn nodded but said nothing. She waited. That weekend, when Conrad arrived as usual, Bryn waited until Jasper and Rosie ran into the yard to play, waited until Walter stepped inside. Then she led Conrad around to the back porch. She stood facing him, arms folded across her chest, brown eyes locked onto his without blinking. "What are you hiding from me? There are people watching my house. Strange cars, shadows at night. I'm not a fool, Conrad. Tell me what's going on." Conrad looked at Bryn standing before him, her brown eyes sharp and unyielding. He knew she wouldn't accept half answers, wouldn't tolerate lies or evasion. She had seen too much, endured too much, to be treated like a fool. He had no choice but to tell her the truth. "There are people in my organization who don't like the changes," Conrad began, his voice low and measured. "They benefited from the old ways, from corruption and exploitation. They're not happy that I'm dismantling it. They see you as a threat. They want to use you to get to me." Bryn frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "Use me? How? I'm just a woman. I don't have power." Conrad held her gaze, and for the first time he truly hesitated. He had told her the truth about the company, about Tucker, about Neil's death. But he had never told her the full truth about himself. "I'm not just a businessman, Bryn," he said slowly, each word heavy. "I run things that aren't legal. People who cross me don't usually get second chances." Bryn stood still for a second, then another, as if absorbing what she had just heard. Then she stepped back, only a small distance, but it struck Conrad like a blade. "You're not just a businessman," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Conrad knew what she meant. "Yes, I am exactly what you think." Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. The children's laughter drifted from the garden, a fragile contrast to the tension on the porch. Bryn looked at him, something fierce flickering in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, anger, perhaps, betrayal, perhaps. "And you brought me into this world. You brought my daughter into this." Conrad stepped forward. "I'm trying to protect you. That's why there are men watching the house. That's why." Bryn cut him off, her voice sharp as glass. "I don't need protection. I need honesty." She stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "I survived losing my husband. I survived poverty. I survived your company trying to destroy me. Don't you dare underestimate me." Conrad stood there, facing the woman who refused to bend, whose eyes burned without fear. She didn't shrink from him the way others did. She stood before him as an equal, not as someone in need of shelter. He felt no anger. Instead, something like deep respect rose within him. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." Bryn studied him for a long moment. The fury in her gaze slowly cooled, replaced by exhaustion and something edged with concern. "What happens now?" Conrad looked toward the garden where Jasper and Rosie played, unaware of the danger circling beyond their laughter. His gray eyes hardened into steel. "Now I end this, before they can ever touch you or Rosie." Conrad moved quickly after his conversation with Bryn that day. He summoned his men, ordered the 3 dissidents located and monitored, and set plans in motion to eliminate the threat before they could act. But he wasn't fast enough. 3 days later, on an ordinary afternoon like any other, Conrad was seated in his Las Vegas office reviewing financial reports when his phone rang. Unknown number. He normally never answered unknown calls, leaving Pierce or his secretary to screen them first. But something made him pick up. Instinct, perhaps. Fate, perhaps. Mr. Ashford. The male voice on the other end was low and laced with smug satisfaction. "We have something of yours," Or should I say, someone. Conrad's blood turned to ice. He shot to his feet, the office chair rolling backward and striking the wall. If you hurt her, he growled, his voice trembling with restrained fury. Laughter echoed through the line. The woman. No, we didn't take the woman. We took something more precious. The little girl. The world collapsed inside Conrad's chest. Rosie. Not Bryn. Rosie. The 5-year-old with wide eyes and a radiant smile. The child who had given Jasper a small stone so he wouldn't forget her. The little girl who had called him Uncle Conrad just last week and asked him if he liked bean soup. What do you want? Conrad asked through clenched teeth. We want you to remember who you are, Mr. Ashford. We want you to stop playing house with that woman and return to business. Real business. We'll contact you with our terms. The line went dead. Conrad stood frozen for a heartbeat, then another, before dialing Bryn's number. She answered on the first ring. Her sobbing tore through the phone like a blade through flesh. They took her, Conrad, she choked. They took my baby. She was playing in the yard and they took her. I was in the kitchen and when I came out, she was gone. Conrad had never heard Bryn say his name before. It had always been Sir. Always distance. But now, in panic and despair, she said Conrad. And that hurt more than anything. I'm coming, he said, his voice hard as steel. Don't move. Don't call the police. I'll handle this. I'll bring her back. He ended the call and summoned Pierce. The bodyguard appeared within 10 seconds, as if he had been waiting outside the door. Mobilize everyone, Conrad ordered, his voice stripped of emotion, reduced to the cold focus of a predator. Everyone. Find that little girl. Now. The next hours were hell. Conrad called in every favor he had accumulated over 20 years. He threatened. He promised. He commanded. His entire network activated to search for a 5-year-old girl with brown hair and eyes like her mother's. Meanwhile, Bryn sat inside the small house, clutching the doll she had carefully mended for her daughter many times, its crooked eye a painful reminder of the daughter she was desperate to find. Walter sat beside his daughter, looking 10 years older within the span of an afternoon. Jasper, not fully understanding what had happened, only knowing that Rosie was gone and the adults were drowning in grief, sat, curled in a corner, holding tightly to the small stone she had given him. 4 hours later, Pierce called with information. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Las Vegas, roughly 40 minutes from the city. The 3 dissidents were hiding there. Rosie was inside. Conrad said nothing. He stood and moved toward the door. Pierce stepped in front of him. Sir, let us go first. We scout the location, confirm numbers, plan the entry. That's protocol. Conrad looked at him, gray eyes like ice yet burning within. That little girl called me Uncle Conrad last week. She gave my son a rock so he wouldn't forget her. I'm going. Pierce held his gaze and knew there was no argument strong enough to stop him. He nodded and stepped aside. Then I'm going with you. Conrad didn't object. He walked out, climbed into the waiting black car, and drove into the Las Vegas night with only one purpose in his mind: bring Rosie home, at any cost. The abandoned warehouse stood at the end of a deserted dirt road, far from any neighborhood, surrounded only by brittle desert brush and the vast darkness of the night. A thin crescent moon cast pale light over the rusted tin roof, creating uneven patches of shadow and silver. The kidnappers had chosen this place because it was remote, because no one would hear a child's cries, but they had underestimated Conrad Ashford. They thought he would negotiate like any other crime lord. They thought he would call, bargain, attempt to smooth things over to preserve order. They believed he would place profit and the stability of his organization above everything else. They were wrong. 3 black cars stopped roughly 200 meters from the warehouse, engines cutting off in unison. Men dressed in black stepped out, moving like shadows across the desert ground. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had been trained for moments like this. Conrad stepped out of the first car. He refused the bulletproof vest Pierce had urged him to wear. He was dressed only in a black shirt and dark trousers. He checked the weapon in his hand and began moving toward the warehouse. Pierce followed closely behind, his eyes scanning every corner of the darkness. The assault was swift and violent, like a desert storm breaking without warning. The 2 guards outside were taken down before they realized anyone had approached. The warehouse door was kicked open, and Conrad's men flooded inside like ghosts. Shouts erupted. Bodies collided. The dull sounds of men hitting concrete echoed through the hollow space. The kidnappers had been careless, convinced they controlled the situation. They hadn't expected Conrad to come so quickly, so decisively. Conrad led his team. He didn't hide behind anyone. He moved past abandoned shelves and crates, gun raised, eyes searching every shadow. He paid no attention to the men being subdued around him. He had only one objective: a small door at the back of the warehouse, secured with a metal bar from the outside. Conrad kicked it open and stepped inside. The room was nearly dark, lit only by a thin shaft of moonlight slipping through a crack in the roof. In the corner, a small figure sat curled up, arms wrapped around her knees, crying softly. "Rosie," Conrad called, and his voice trembled. The little girl lifted her head. Her wide eyes were red from tears, her cheeks streaked and swollen. When she recognized the man standing in the doorway, hope ignited in those exhausted eyes. "Uncle Conrad." Conrad dropped to his knees, setting his gun aside. His voice softened completely, stripped of every trace of cold authority. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. No one will hurt you anymore." Rosie ran toward him across the cold concrete floor. She threw herself into his arms and clung to him, sobbing against his shoulder. Her small body trembled, but she refused to let go. Conrad wrapped his arms around her tightly, as if someone might try to rip her away again. His eyes burned, and for the first time in 20 years, Conrad Ashford felt tears threaten to fall. For the first time in his life, he prayed. He didn't know to whom. He wasn't sure he believed in anything above, but he prayed that she was unharmed, that he had arrived in time. Through broken sobs, Rosie whispered, "I wasn't scared. I knew you'd come." Jasper said his daddy always keeps promises. Conrad felt his heart shatter and mend in the same breath. He lifted Rosie into his arms and carried her out of the dark room. Outside, the moonlight touched her brown hair, giving it a faint halo. She had stopped crying. Exhaustion pulled her eyelids closed as she drifted to sleep in his embrace, trusting completely that he would keep her safe. Pierce approached, his face as unreadable as ever, though something flickered in his eyes as he looked at the sleeping child. "Sir, we have the 3 leaders. What do you want to do with them?" Conrad looked down at Rosie, her small face finally peaceful. Then he raised his gaze to Pierce, his gray eyes colder than ever. "Make sure they never threaten anyone again. Ever." The black car pulled up in front of the small wooden house just as the eastern sky began to fade from deep black to a pale gray. Dawn was breaking, and with it came the end of the longest, most terrifying night of Bryn's life. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. She had sat on the porch the entire night, staring down the dark dirt road, praying, begging, waiting, and now the car was here. Bryn sprang to her feet and ran toward it before the engine even cut off. Her bare feet struck the cold ground, but she felt nothing. She saw only the car coming to a stop, only the door opening. Conrad stepped out, and in his arms was a little girl fast asleep, brown hair tangled and resting against his shoulder. Rosie, her daughter, safe. Bryn didn't know when she started crying. She only knew that tears were streaming down her face as she reached them, as she lifted her trembling hand to touch her daughter's hair to make sure this was real, that Rosie was truly here, that she wasn't dreaming. Conrad gently transferred Rosie into her arms. The child felt lighter than Bryn remembered. Or perhaps she only seemed lighter because the crushing weight of terror that had pressed on Bryn's chest all night had finally been lifted. Bryn clutched her daughter tightly and couldn't speak. She only wept, deep broken sobs, as though every tear she had held back for 6 long years poured out at once. Rosie stirred in her mother's embrace, eyelids fluttering open. "Mommy," she murmured, still half asleep. "I had a bad dream." Bryn kissed her forehead, her cheeks, every inch of her tear-stained little face. "It's over, baby. It's over. You're safe. You're home." Small footsteps pounded across the wooden floor inside, and Jasper burst out of the house. Pierce had brought him earlier, unwilling to let the boy remain alone in the empty mansion while everyone else focused on the rescue. "Rosie," he shouted, eyes shining with relief. "You're okay." He ran forward and wrapped his arms around her, not caring that she was still in her mother's hold. Rosie blinked more fully awake when she saw him, and the first smile since the nightmare bloomed across her face. "Jasper, I wasn't scared. I knew Uncle Conrad would come." Walter stood on the porch, leaning against a wooden post for support. He had aged 10 years in a single night, his face drawn, his eyes red from exhaustion and fear. But when he saw his granddaughter safe in Bryn's arms, his own eyes filled with tears. He looked at Conrad, and for the first time there was no suspicion there. No guarded judgment from a father protecting his daughter from powerful men. Only deep gratitude and a quiet acceptance Conrad had never imagined earning from him. Conrad stepped back, then another step, giving the family space. He felt like an outsider looking into a painting of a family to which he did not belong. But then Bryn passed Rosie to Walter and turned toward him. She walked up slowly, tears still glistening on her cheeks, though she was no longer crying. She studied him for a long moment, searching his gray eyes for something only she could define. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. Conrad shook his head. "I'm sorry. My world put her in danger. If it weren't for me, this wouldn't have." He let the sentence fall away. He expected her to step back, to remember that he had been the root of all this pain, to send him away as she once had. But Bryn didn't retreat. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and took his hand. Her calloused fingers wrapped around his, warm and steady. "Your world also saved her. You saved her." For the first time, she reached for him, and Conrad stood there, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, and found himself without words. In the days following the kidnapping, Conrad cleansed his organization with the same ruthless efficiency he had perfected over 20 years. The 3 men who orchestrated the abduction vanished without a trace, without a sound. No one asked where they had gone. No one dared to look for them. In Conrad's world, there were questions people learned never to ask. He restructured the entire chain of power within the organization. Those who had once stood close to Tucker Webb and the 3 dissidents were removed. Some were dismissed outright. Some were reassigned to positions stripped of authority. Others simply disappeared, much like their former allies. In their place, Conrad elevated men and women he trusted, individuals who had proven their loyalty over years, who weren't swayed by short-term profit or personal gain. 1 week after the rescue, Conrad summoned every senior manager to headquarters. They stood in the large conference room, dozens of men and women in expensive suits, silent and waiting. The air was tight as wire. Word of what had happened to the 3 dissidents had already spread through the organization, and everyone understood this meeting wasn't for discussion. Conrad stood at the head of the room. He didn't sit. He didn't lean. He stood upright, gray eyes sweeping across every face. When he spoke, his voice wasn't raised, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. "From this day forward, the Holloway family is protected as my own. Anyone who looks at them wrong answers to me. There are no second warnings." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. No one moved. No one cleared their throat or glanced away. They understood. The Holloway family was now shielded by the full force of the Ashford Empire. To touch them was to challenge Conrad himself, and no one wanted to discover what that would mean. After the meeting, Conrad sat alone in his office, gazing out at the glittering sprawl of Las Vegas below. He thought about the past months, the broken car on a desert road, the night sky heavy with stars, the moment he carried Rosie out of that dark warehouse. His power hadn't changed. He was still Conrad Ashford, the most powerful crime lord on the West Coast. People still feared him. They still bowed their heads. They still didn't dare oppose him. But something inside him had shifted. Once, he used power to control, to punish defiance, to instill fear and enforce obedience. Power had been a weapon, a shield, a fortress built so no one could ever threaten him the way they had threatened his father long ago. Now he still used power, but he used it to protect Rosie from men who would harm her, to protect Bryn from those who would intimidate her, to protect factory workers from becoming the next victims of men like Tucker Webb. It was a small shift in perspective, yet it transformed the meaning of power in his hands entirely. And that was what Bryn had taught him, though she never knew it. She had shown him that true strength doesn't lie in making people afraid. It lies in making them feel safe. A few weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or at least to a new version of normal. Rosie no longer woke from nightmares every night. She could play in the yard again without fear, though Bryn still kept her within sight at all times. The guards Conrad had assigned remained around the house, but they had become part of the landscape now, like silent statues standing watch over the family's fragile peace. One weekend evening, Conrad arrived at the small house as he always did. Jasper had fallen asleep beside Rosie. After a long day of play, the 2 children curled together with Penny, the doll resting between them. Walter had gone to bed early. His coughing had eased considerably, thanks to the new medication. though he still needed his rest. Only Conrad and Bryn remained in the small kitchen. Bryn stood at the sink, washing the dinner plates. Conrad stood beside her, holding a dish towel, attempting to help despite having no experience whatsoever. He handled the towel awkwardly, as though it were some unfamiliar weapon he had never been trained to use. Bryn glanced at him, watched the way he struggled with the plate and cloth, and couldn't suppress a smile. "You're terrible at this." Conrad looked down at the plate in his hands, then back at her with a rare grin. "I've never done it before. This is the first time in my life I've dried a dish." Bryn gave a soft laugh and continued rinsing. "A mafia boss who can't dry dishes. What else don't you know how to do?" Conrad set the plate carefully on the counter and turned toward her. The humor faded from his expression, replaced by something deeper and more serious. "I don't know how to say what I feel," Iski said quietly. "My whole life has been deals and negotiations. I know how to threaten. I know how to persuade. I know how to make people bend. But with you, I don't want to negotiate. I don't want to make a deal. I just want to be with you." Bryn's hands stilled beneath the running water. She shut off the faucet and turned to face him fully, brown eyes meeting gray in the warm yellow light of the kitchen. "You're a mafia boss," she said softly. "I'm a widow with nothing. This is crazy." "I know," Conrad replied without looking away. She continued, as if listing every reason it couldn't possibly work. "People will talk. Your enemies will see me as a weakness." Conrad stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Let them. I've never had a weakness worth protecting before. Now I do." Bryn studied him for a long moment, weighing the truth in his voice. Then a real smile broke across her face, the first unguarded smile she had allowed herself since Neil died 6 years ago. "You're still learning how to be human, aren't you?" Conrad nodded without pride or denial. "I am. Will you teach me?" Bryn dried her hands and reached for him. Her calloused palm settled over his, rough from years of labor, touching a hand that had signed orders of life and death, that had wielded immense power. Two hands from different worlds, yet fitting together with unexpected ease. "We take it slow," Bryn said gently but firmly. "For the kids, for us, for this family we're figuring out." Conrad closed his fingers around hers, careful yet certain, as though he were holding the most precious thing he had ever known. "Slow. I can learn slow." 1 year passed from that fateful night on the desert road. 1 year filled with upheaval, with transformation, and with quiet miracles none of them could have imagined. The Nevada factory of Ashford Industries had become a model for labor conditions across the industry. Equipment was inspected and maintained every single month. No more broken machines left unrepaired. No more hidden dangers waiting to maim or kill. Wages had increased significantly, enough for workers to support their families without juggling 2 or 3 additional jobs. Health insurance and maternity benefits were provided to every employee, and most importantly, there was an anonymous reporting channel so anyone could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Other companies began visiting, observing, asking how a factory, once notorious for unsafe conditions, had managed such a complete transformation. Bryn had become an official partner in Ashford Industries, a minority shareholder with decisive authority in all matters concerning worker welfare. She was no longer the impoverished widow the company had cast aside. She was the woman who had changed it from within, who had turned her grief into strength to protect others. Walter was far healthier now under the care of the best physicians Conrad could find. He still lived in the small wooden house in the desert. The house had been repaired and improved, yet it retained its simple soul. He still grew vegetables in the garden. He still kept chickens. He still sat on the porch each evening, smoking and watching the sun sink into the horizon. Some things didn't need changing. Walter belonged there. Jasper and Rosie had become like true siblings. They attended the same school, sat at the same desk, and stood up for one another against any bully foolish enough to try. Jasper, once withdrawn and lonely, was now more confident and joyful than anyone had ever seen him. Rosie, who had grown up with so little, now had a big brother who shared everything with her without hesitation. And Conrad still ran his empire. He was still powerful, still feared by his enemies. But he was different. He had learned that true strength doesn't lie in making others afraid. It lies in making them feel safe and loved. One Sunday evening, the whole family gathered in the small house. Walter stood by the stove cooking bean soup from his old recipe, the aroma filling every corner. Bryn kneaded dough for bread, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Jasper and Rosie sat at the table, talking over each other as they shared stories from school, laughter ringing through the room. Conrad sat beside the children, sleeves rolled up, ready to clear the dishes when dinner ended. He had learned to dry plates over the past year, though he still wasn't particularly skilled. "Dad helped me with my math homework today," Jasper announced proudly, eyes shining. Rosie glanced at him and said softly, "My dad used to help me too." She paused briefly before continuing. "Mommy told me my dad used to sing to me even before I was born." Her voice held no sharp grief, only gentle remembrance, a tender memory of the father she had lost. The room fell quiet for a moment. Conrad looked at her, his gray eyes warm. "Your dad would be very proud of you." Rosie smiled, bright and certain. "I know. Mommy tells me every day." After dinner, the children ran outside to play, while Walter settled into his chair with the newspaper. Conrad and Bryn stood on the porch watching the Nevada sunset. The sky shifted from orange to violet, then to deepening blue as the first stars appeared. In the yard, Jasper tried to teach Rosie how to kick a soccer ball. He kicked too hard and sent it sailing over her head. She ran after it, tripped, and rolled in the grass. Jasper rushed over, stumbled as well, and the two lay there laughing uncontrollably. Walter lowered his newspaper and called out, "You know what I think about you now." Conrad turned. "That I'm still learning." Walter shook his head, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. "That my daughter finally has someone who'll fight for her. Not just with money, with everything." Conrad nodded without hesitation. "I will. Always." Bryn leaned her head against Conrad's shoulder, and for the first time she truly let go. No more constant vigilance, no more second-guessing. She simply stood there beside the man next to her and felt peace. "Your car broke down at the right time, in the right place," she murmured. Conrad took her hand, "and I met the right person." She looked up at him, brown eyes glowing in the fading light. "Do you ever regret it? Coming back, telling me the truth?" Conrad shook his head. "It's the only right thing I've ever done." He tightened his hold on her hand as they watched the two children laughing in the grass. And Conrad knew this was where he belonged. That bottle of water on a cold desert night hadn't only saved a thirsty little boy, it had saved the soul of a man who had forgotten how to be human. And sometimes the most beautiful stories don't begin with grand plans or towering power, but with a simple act of kindness from a stranger on a dark road. This story reminds us that kindness is never meaningless. A small bottle of water, a simple helping hand, can change a life, even many lives. It also reminds us that it's never too late to change, never too late to do the right thing, and never too late to become a better person. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with those you love. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more moving stories each day. We would love to know how you felt about this story. Have you ever received unexpected help from a stranger? Or have you ever helped someone without expecting anything in return? Share your story in the comments below. We truly look forward to hearing what's in your heart. Finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for spending your time with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.